Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Whenever you're joining us, welcome. My name is Mike Barnett, and I'm here to reveal the identity of the oil wreck. The oil wreck is a long, unidentified shipwreck resting off the Dry Tortugas in the lower Florida Keys. This site has been misidentified not just once, but twice. In the latter case, recently NOAA, the U.S. Coast Guard, and maritime archaeologists identified this wreck as a World War II casualty without any definitive evidence and ignored mountains of contradictory evidence.
A careful marine archaeological study was conducted during the assessment, resulting in the discovery that the two vessels, MUNGER T and JOSEPH M, CUDAHY, had been misidentified for nearly 80 years.
So in order to unravel the tangled history of the oil wreck, we need to discuss the events of May 4th, 1942. And that's the day U-507 entered into the Gulf of Mexico and scored a hat trick. It sank 3 ships in the matter of hours. And these sinkings is what caused all this confusion because no one's properly analyzed, evaluated, and uncovered all this evidence and tried to lay out the battlefield and where these potential ships went down. So in this video, I'm going to try to not only unveil the identity of the oil wreck, but 2 others. So I'm going to try to score my own hat trick. The motivation for doing this video is to set the record straight, because facts matter and history matters. This misidentification is now being propagated in TV shows, newspaper articles, and it's going to be burned into history. And it's wrong. So it's time to really dig into this, analyze it, evaluate it, and find out the real truth. So we've got a lot of material to cover here. So let's buckle up and get to it. So first off, the oil wreck. This site is 25 miles north-northeast of the Dry Tortugas in 140 feet of water. And it gains its name for obvious reasons. It's been leaking oil for decades. And it is not uncommon when you pull up to the site, there's be a big sheen of oil that marks the spot of the wreck below. So this wreck is in largely 2 pieces. The stern, which is resting on its starboard side, is broken right forward to the machinery spaces. And then you have the forward cargo areas, which is more about 120 degrees harder over on its starboard side, almost turtled. I started diving this wreck 25 years ago. And the oil wreck obviously earned its name because you can go up inside the cargo holds in the forward section and see congealed gelatinous oil still in large quantities up in the cargo holds being trapped by the hull itself. It was not uncommon when you're in decompression to have globules of oil floating up around you. You had to be very aware, and many times the anchor line or the bolt hole would be covered with oil as it's drifting in the current. So again, fairly obvious, this is a tanker carrying a cargo of oil. In 2002, when I first started drafting my first book, Shipwrecks of the Sunshine State, I wanted to try to identify this wreck. Now keep in mind, it was much different then than it is now as far as resources. You didn't have access to just vast volumes of material, whether it be newspaper articles, insurance records, or deck logs that have all been scanned in. No, it was much different. You had to go to libraries and museums and scan through physical documents or miles of microfilm to try to find that nugget of information you needed. And at the time, I was aware of the events of May 4th, 1942, and one candidate kind of jumped out at me, and that was the Joseph M. CUDAHY. This was a tanker carrying oil, which fit the cargo that we're talking about here at the oil wreck. And we know on May 4th, 1942, she was the third of 3 ships attacked, and she didn't sink right away. She drifted for over 2 days, burning and smoldering before finally being scuttled. And going through some of the scanned information I had, it was obvious, knowing the location where she was attacked, that she could potentially have drifted over this spot. So it seemed plausible at the time, and I was a little careless in that conclusion. So yes, I was responsible for the very first misidentification of this wreck. As we'll soon find out, that's not the identity of this wreck. So let's fast forward to 2007. That's the year that Joe Satelli and myself explored a deepwater shipwreck called the Phosphate carrier off Naples, Florida. So this wreck, resting in 430 feet of water, turned out to be another tanker. And we started to dig into it a little bit more and getting some archival information. So it's now 5 years into the future, and I was able to get some additional information from the National Archives, including the logbooks from the U-507, as well as pages from several patrol vessels in the U.S. Navy and other correspondence. Not only did we get information indicating that the phosphate carrier is the MUNGER T ball, but also some of the additional information we got cast a lot of doubt on the oil wreck being the Joseph M. CUDAHY. So I set out to try to find new information and a suspect that fit the attributes and location of the oil wreck. But it wasn't a priority, so I largely put a pin in it and moved on. In 2010, Congress authorized funding to analyze and evaluate potentially polluting shipwrecks in U.S. waters. This assessment, known as the Remediation of Underwater Legacy Environmental Threats, or RULET, was completed in 2013, and in that process identified 87 wrecks that needed further evaluation and risk assessment. So these additional assessments were done on numerous shipwrecks, including the Joseph M. CUDAHY and the MUNGER T ball. 2 of the shipwrecks sunk on May 4th, 1942. And this process really wasn't as in-depth as you'd think it'd be. In large part, they just scraped the internet and other easily available information to basically provide information on the target vessel, its cargo, and doing a basic risk assessment based on parameters developed during this process. In fact, you can see in the risk assessment reports for the CUDAHY and the MUNGER T ball, they have trip reports and other information from us and also citations from my book. And it carries over that mistake of the Joseph M. CUDAHY potentially being the oil wreck. So we're seeing this error now carrying over multiple years and into this process. So the next step in this roulette process was to go out and ground truth the high-risk sites to evaluate them to see if remediation was a viable option. In 2013, NOAA funded an AUV survey of the oil wreck site, and the resulting side-scan sonar mosaic image basically presents our first glimpse of the site as a whole, and it basically just reaffirmed some of the initial assessments in that roulette study. And we're still carrying over that the oil wreck is thought to be the Joseph M. CUDAHY. In 2021, Resolve Marine and the U.S. Coast Guard went out to the oil wreck site to start remediation. During that project, Resolve Marine used ROVs and divers to help extract the trapped oil from within the hull of the oil wreck site. Following that project, Resolve produced a very interesting report. In it, they basically concluded that the oil wreck site was not the Joseph M. CUDAHY, which again, we already have cast doubt onto that based on research following our phosphate carrier dives. But now they're concluding the oil wreck is the MUNGER T ball. So I'm confused. In this report, they only evaluated 2 options though. The oil wreck being either the MUNGER T ball or the Joseph M. CUDAHY. So they've set themselves up for a false dichotomy because they've not considered other alternatives. And that's going to come and bite them in the ass. When I first saw this report, it's very convincing. But then there's a lot of red flags it obviously ignores. I mean, this was an oil remediation. The wreck is called the oil wreck. But as we're going to discuss here in a second, the MUNGER T ball was not carrying oil. It was carrying gasoline. And that's a problem. Also, the location is incorrect. And some other just diagnostic analysis of this wreck site. It's a very poor job. And I'm actually surprised that without more thorough analysis that they came out to the conclusion that the oil wreck was definitively the MUNGER T ball. We're going to have to discuss the chain of events on May 4th, 1942 to really get to the bottom of this and also demonstrate there is no way the oil wreck can be the MUNGER T ball or the Joseph M. CUDAHY. And we're going to find out the real identity of the oil wreck. In the early afternoon hours of May 4th, 1942, the German submarine U-507 rounds the Dry Tortugas and takes up station at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, waiting for any valuable Allied targets to cross its path. These images I'm going to present condenses all available information on that first battle in the Gulf of Mexico, where the U-507 scored this hat trick. Now, it's a lot of information at first, so I'm going to pull it back at first. It looks very chaotic, and I'm going to explain everything basically attack by attack. Now, all this information that I'm presenting here comes from numerous sources. It comes from the war diary of the U-507 itself. It has all the position information, the timing, the sequence of events, as well as all the basically available Allied information that was being reported at the time. Now, it's important let's really consider the information sources. So how did the U-boats report their position? Now, the Kriegsmarine developed this very ingenious way of encrypting where subs were being deployed and where attacks were occurring. And this is the grid system. Rather than giving a geographical location or a landmark, it used a coded letters and numbers grid system that corresponded to a certain block on a map. So in the war diary of U-507, they used the grid system here, and you can actually plot out where it was and follow along during its voyage, and that's what I've done here. So it's essential not only to plot out all this information, but also to understand the credibility or accuracy of this information. And it shouldn't come as any surprise that more likely than not, the hunter is always going to be more accurate than the hunted, because as you can see in these attack logs for the U-507 on the Joseph M. CUDAHY and the MUNGER T ball, it plots out when they first sighted their target and intercept courses in the attack positions. So again, they're stalking their prey. Meanwhile, the crew on the tankers, they're not going to know they're actually being targeted until that torpedo slams into the side of the hull, and now it's just pure chaos. All hell's breaking loose. And the last thing that they're probably trying to do is plot their position. So again, there's going to be a lot of question and doubt to the accuracy of an Allied report position, whereas the Germans, again, with this grid system that was phenomenally accurate, as well as the fact that they've probably been stalking these targets for more than a half hour to an hour. Again, they're plotting all these positions and recording all this information, so it's much more credible information. And I also try to calibrate these information sources by evaluating Allied versus German war records. As you can see here, I've plotted through the report positions of various losses during World War II and the Allied position versus the German position. In the majority of these cases, the German position was much more accurate than the Allied position. There obviously are a few anomalies and outliers there, but again, this should come as no surprise that, again, the hunter is going to know where they're at as they're stalking the prey, and the hunted is basically unaware of the impending doom. So we're going to break this down now and look at it attack by attack, because this battlefield is going to tell a story. It's going to help us basically make sense of where all the wrecks lie, and also to consider whether or not any of these are candidates for the oil wreck site. It didn't take long for targets to come to the attention of U-507. Where they were sitting just west of the Dry Tortugas allowed for vessels streaming out from Galveston, New Orleans, or Mobile to cross its path. So rather than expending fuel and chasing down targets, they waited for targets to come to them. And the first victim, the NORLINDO, was sent to the bottom at 5:42 p.m. After U-507 attacked NORLINDO, it moved off to the west a little bit to monitor communications and look for its next target. So after moving to the west, it didn't take long to find the next target. And as you can see here, the next position as she moved north to intercept several tankers headed its way. And the next vessel was the MUNGER T ball. It saw it cross its path, and it moved to the northeast to intercept. And at that point, the war diary is very clear. It set a single torpedo at about a third of a mile away in distance. Torpedo struck the starboard side in the forward third of the ship and erupted in flames and went down in about 15 minutes. Now this vessel is erupting in flames, and another tanker was nearby, the Joseph M. CUDAHY. And we have the reported position where the Joseph M. CUDAHY reported the attack. So everything so far is quite distant from the site of the oil wreck. We're talking about 60 to 70 miles away at its nearest point. So it casts a lot of doubt. How could the MUNGER T ball drift in 15 minutes almost 70 miles? And it's just simply not possible. And again, all Allied communications support this. I mean, not just the U-507, the veracity and the accuracy of their documents, but now all the other information from the Joseph M. CUDAHY, which is now going to be the third and final victim on May 4th, 1942. So now that Joseph M. CUDAHY has reported the position of the attack on MUNGER T ball, but has now also revealed its position, and the U-507 quickly turns its interest to this vessel as it heads north. Now realizing it's in danger, the Joseph M. CUDAHY turns north, trying to evade the U-507, but it didn't work. U-507 quickly caught up to the tanker and put a torpedo in the side at 9:28. Now, unlike the NORLINDO and the MUNGER T ball, the Joseph M. CUDAHY drifted for over 2 days before she ultimately was scuttled by a U.S. Navy patrol yacht. And we have all this information. It caused some of the confusion. Again, going through this, it was unclear which tanker was which. There was, for a while there They thought the drifting tanker was the MUNGER T Ball and the Joseph M. CUDAHY had already been sunk. And we can follow over these 2 days as the vessel smoldered and burned. We can see all the reported positions from Allied aircraft and vessels plotting its course south as it was pushed along by the Florida loop current. This all makes sense. The oceanographic currents in this area is consistent with it moving south at this rate in this direction. And ultimately, we have the logbook position of the USS Coral showing that she was basically asked permission and was granted to scuttle the vessel because she was now a hazard for navigation, which was ultimately granted, and she proceeded to scuttle the vessel using her deck gun. In this battle map that I'm presenting here, we have all available information indicating where these vessels were attacked and ultimately met their fate. And none of these positions, not one, are anywhere near the vicinity of the oil wreck site. Now, all this information, not one piece of it supports the assertion by NOAA, U.S. Coast Guard, and maritime archaeologists with Search Inc. that the oil wreck is the MUNGER T Ball. The historical record simply does not support it. So if the oil wreck is not the Joseph M. CUDAHY or the MUNGER T Ball, what is it? Well, as I mentioned back in 2008, 2009, I started having doubts on it being the Joseph M. CUDAHY. So I started doing a little bit of digging, and one of the initial candidates that came to the forefront was the tanker E.J. Bullock. Now, what's strange about this is I don't know how this vessel eluded the search parameters of the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, and maritime archaeologists when they were doing the whole roulette assessments, because this is a prime candidate for that given her cargo of crude oil that she was carrying. So the basic chain of events happened on October 6, 1938, as the E.J. Bullock carrying a cargo of crude oil approached the Dry Tortugas. Suddenly, a large explosion erupted in the forward cargo hold and tore through the front portion of the ship, carrying away the radio masts. Now, an SOS really wasn't necessary because large plumes of black smoke emitted from the ship as she's burned for over 30 minutes, alerting the O.M. Burnouth and the Franklin K. Lane of the distress of the ship, and they rushed to the scene. Now, we have all information about the position of where this happened, and all the reports state 25 miles east of the Dry Tortugas. Now, there are some variations to that theme. We have a few that say northeast. We have a lot of them that say east by south, strangely, which puts it in very shallow water near the Marquesas. And we also have one west of the Dry Tortugas. But of note, all of these positions are basically consistent in the 25-mile distance. Now, if you remember when I talked about the description of the site of the oil wreck, the distance from the Dry Tortugas was almost exactly 25 miles. So that's something that can't be ignored. I mean, the distance and the historical record are starting to line up there. Again, nothing corresponds to the Joseph M. CUDAHY or the MUNGER T Ball, but we do have a candidate here that deserves further scrutiny. Other information on the loss of the E.J. Bullock said that she sank in about 90 feet of water. And again, the depth of the oil wreck is 140. Not precise, not exact, but in the ballpark. Again, given the time period and everything, what was transpiring, it basically, what it demonstrates is this happened in shallow water and not deep offshore waters like where the MUNGER T Ball and the Joseph M. CUDAHY were attacked, if you plot it out on a chart. Now, trying to find additional supporting information to confirm my theory, I thought it'd be fairly easy to track down information from the U.S. Coast Guard from a following investigation onto the explosion and loss of the ship, or the logbooks of the O.M. Burnouth or the Franklin K. Lane, the rescue ships, or through survivors' reports. But what's interesting about this is, in the wake of this incident, the shipping company, the Standard Oil Company, basically put a gag order on the crew. And no information after a few days after the survivors were landed in Key West and then moved on to Miami is found in the historical record. I mean, I tracked down through all sorts of repositories trying to find information on the vessels through National Archives, Coast Guard archives, archives that held information from the Standard Oil Company, hoping to find information that they might have had their internal investigation, or Lloyd's of London. I mean, so it's just a black hole of information, which I find very peculiar. Nonetheless, we still have the information that warrants further scrutiny. So now we have to dig into the diagnostic features on the wreck. We're going to test our theory by looking at the vessel itself and comparing it to other candidates, namely the MUNGER T Ball that the Coast Guard, NOAA, and maritime archaeologists at Search Inc. Basically assert that this vessel is. Now, I was able to obtain the general arrangement plans of both the MUNGER T Ball and the E.J. Bullock to compare and contrast, again, as well as the Joseph M. CUDAHY. And I was unable to find any other suspect vessels that really fit the criteria, location, or the attributes of this wreck site. So we're going to look at these to compare and contrast to figure out what the identity of the oil wreck is. And it's interesting that, again, this false dichotomy that this archaeological report produces, I mean, they're trapped into this bias confirmation. Basically, if it's not this, it must be this, because they've confined themselves to only two alternatives. They've ruled out other potential suspect vessels, or haven't even considered other suspect vessels. And this becomes obvious as I reached out to archaeologists that were involved in this project, and they were totally oblivious to the presence or existence of the E.J. Bullock and never considered it as a candidate for the oil wreck. Now, in this report that they produced, basically ruling out the Joseph M. CUDAHY and supporting, or basically asserting that the oil wreck is the MUNGER T Ball, it's interesting to note that a lot of the things that they say support the MUNGER T Ball and rule out the Joseph CUDAHY supports the E.J. Bullock. Here's a great case in point. They use the measurements of the forward section, basically from the bow to the superstructure, to rule out that the wreck could possibly be the Joseph M. CUDAHY. And this measurement is fairly consistent with the MUNGER T Ball, but it's also, as it turns out to be, almost exactly the same for the E.J. Bullock. So again, because they've limited themselves in the scope of analysis, they've really done themselves a disservice and set themselves up for failure. In subsequent reports, not only this report, where again they don't provide any definitive evidence to say that this is the MUNGER T Ball. They basically, again, because it can't be the Joseph M. CUDAHY, it must be the MUNGER T Ball. But no physical evidence, no real diagnostic evidence, and they never even look at the historical record, which should have alerted them in the first place that this can't be the MUNGER T Ball. So again, very confusing. And again, even using the excuse that this was not a thorough archaeological examination, if that's the case, you should not be making any definitive conclusions about anything. I mean, historical accuracy is paramount, because now they've made this a World War II gravesite, when the actual gravesite, the actual battleground, they've muddied the waters completely. And they had a memorial service out here. They've basically had a plaque laying on this wreck, and it's not the MUNGER T Ball. Again, I'm going to show you more evidence to support that conclusion. So the next thing we're going to look at is, they also, in some of these subsequent archaeological reports, again, reasserting that this wreck is definitively the MUNGER T Ball, just their conclusions and their analyses of the wreck and reading the damage on the wreck is very just plainly incorrect. I mean, it's troubling that they don't recognize what they're actually looking at on the bottom. So take, for example, the prop on the stern of this wreck, on the oil wreck. They basically presume that the missing blade occurred because divers cut it off. I mean, I can understand that. I mean, it's typical that archaeologists, blame divers for some of the damage they see on wrecks. I mean, divers do recover artifacts. There have been salvage activities that have recovered valuable props of other World War II wrecks. Following World War II, they were actually sold the rights to salvage these wrecks. Nonetheless, they ignore the basic overall layout and other diagnostic features that demonstrate this is not the case, because just forward of the prop, you can see the skag or the keel of the ship bent, and there's a missing rudder, which is laying off the ship itself. I mean, it's very obvious this ship sank stern first, which is consistent, as you can see this newspaper article, that she was settling by the stern. And also they ignore the damage that's just on almost, about 100 feet back from the bow. You can see the multi-beam image. They totally ignore that. They don't discuss it or determine the origins. And looking at the bow itself, you can see dramatic damage there. There's just so many features. It's just chaos. There's just things have just been torn loose. The hawse pipe has been ripped loose. So one potential scenario is the explosion that happened in the forward cargo hold, as documented in the archival reports, basically just wreaked havoc. Obviously, it caused damage in the forward third of the ship all the way to the bridge. It's in the forward dry cargo hold there. I tried to present all this information about 8 months ago. I emailed the maritime archaeologists that were involved in this report, and I also included colleagues at NOAA, because again, it was the Office of Marine Sanctuaries was part of this roulette process. Because again, this is the very first battleground of World War II in the Gulf of Mexico. It warrants discussion and analysis, and also to reveal the true identity of the E.J. Bullock, because again, facts matter, positions matter. If we're just going to like put a plaque anywhere in the ocean, I mean, what's the point? I mean, why are you doing the assessment and evaluation if you're not going to try to make sure it's valid and accurate? So I found it interesting, though, when I emailed my colleagues at NOAA, they immediately decided, because it's not this wreck site, the oil wreck is not in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, that they're going to bow out of the discussion. I was, disappointed, but I understand and respect their opinion. And to their credit, the archaeologists kept up a communication with me, and I tried to propose some of my early findings, again, trying to show that there's potential serious doubt here that the oil wreck is indeed the MUNGER T ball. And I did, again, it's hard to read tone and tenor in emails, but I think it's fair to assess the responses I was getting as respectfully dismissive. Again, I could not convince them of any of the facts. They kept leaning in on the witnesses report. They tried to validate the oil that they recovered. I mean, this is heavy oil, as saying that maybe it was diesel. And again, there's no record of this carrying diesel, but gasoline. That was another error in the NOAA report. So again, just they would not believe their eyes, the actual report. They, again, ego and pride, I think, have prevented them from even considering an alternative. And so here we are with this video, because again, it's important to present this for them to digest, the wider community, divers, archaeologists, and again, to present what I think is a great example of the pitfalls that happen with false dichotomy and bias confirmation, because again, they continually tried to make sense of it in the optics of this has to be the MUNGER T ball. Again, I could not find that smoking gun. Obviously, if I found a bell or an artifact that had some kind of traceable information to tie it to the E.J. Bullock, that would have been great. And in fact, one unique artifact was recovered back 25 years ago, and that was an engine order telegraph from the engine room itself. And that, on the front of the face of this, it had the manufacturer's information, Charles Corey and Sons of New York. Now, other information tried to tie this as maybe supportive of an East Coast build, whereas the E.J. Bullock was built in 1920 in San Francisco, California. So initially, finding an artifact that's tied to New York might cause problems. But again, Charles Corey and Son corporate office is in New York, and every single of their engine order telegraphs they produced, they're a large manufacturer, were all stamped New York. That's their base hub. But it's important to note they had satellite offices around the country, and their office in San Francisco was less than 3 miles away from the yard that built the E.J. Bullock as a William H. Mahoney in 1920. So again, we're seeing a lot of information, it's all circumstantial, but nonetheless, everything is pointing towards this wreck being the E.J. Bullock. I have found nothing to date that basically casts doubt on that. Again, I'm trying to, in all my conversations, again, they did entertain a lot of my questions. The archaeologist responded again, and I was hoping for them to poke bigger holes in this, but they didn't. Again, they just pivoted to the fact that the NOAA report, the roulette assessment, supported their conclusions, ignoring the historical record, ignoring their own eyes, ignoring the fact this was carrying oil, not gasoline. In earnest, I wanted to, again, provide more information for analysis of these sites. So earlier this year, I went out and did a couple different trips to the oil wreck. It had been probably 15 years since I've been to the site, and she's changed a lot. Again, I first noticed that the Resolve Marine Group did a fantastic job cleaning the hull. There's no trace of oil in the 4 cargo holds and all the oil tanks. It was spotless, simply amazing. And also the wreck over the past 15 years or so has compressed considerably, which is not surprising. She sits on a sandy bottom, and there's been numerous hurricanes in that period that have gone right over the wreck. So she's a lot lower, compressed down. And again, we're comparing tanker to tanker. So again, we're trying to find the fingerprints, the DNA of these that, even though they look very similar, there's always going to be discrete differences, and you got to look for that. So I poured over the general arrangement plans of these two ships. And now, a problem with the Resolve Marine Group analysis using the multi-beam image is the length overall that they calculated doesn't fit the MUNGER T ball, it doesn't fit the E.J. Bullock, it doesn't fit the Joseph M. CUDAHY. There's a problem there, and that's something they could not reconcile. This presents an issue because the measurement calculated by Resolve Marine Group and archaeologists is much shorter than the 435-foot length of the E.J. Bullock. I need to find something unique to the E.J. Bullock that separated it from the MUNGER T ball. I mean, the stern section, the distance from the rudder post to in the front of the boilers was almost identical. The boiler diameter between the two ships was about the same. So again, nothing. There would be no way to definitively differentiate the two. Again, the lengths between the two are both, the MUNGER T ball is shorter than the E.J. Bullock, but they're both missing length based on the calculated length by Resolve Marine Group. Now, going into the breach there, the forward section of the hull, I noticed this steam piping just forward of where the boiler space would be. You actually can see that in the E.J. Bullock plans. I don't see that in the available general arrangement plans for the MUNGER T ball. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I actually found documentation, as you can see in this video, that you see exactly on the plans for the E.J. Bullock. So again, we're seeing, and that gives you an idea also, what you're seeing there. Now we can see where that breach is in the forward section. And what we're seeing here is we're missing a portion of the ship. We can see the front of the boiler on the port side, it's in the stern section. And then there's basically almost 40 foot of ship that's missing. It's in between the front of the boiler space and we see that steam piping in the forward section. We're missing a good section of a hull. And looking at the general arrangement plans, we can see the fuel oil tank, a void space, and the cargo pump room that's missing. And as we move forward here to the bridge, that structure still exists to basically the steel accommodations deck that was above the main deck. And the distances between the E.J. Bullock and the MUNGER T ball were different. The MUNGER T ball had a smaller footprint. The length of that steel accommodation deck was only 27.9 feet in length, whereas the Bullock was 31.25 feet in length. And taking the measurements, and you can see that again, see that footprint of where that accommodations deck was, I got a length of 31 feet. So again, too big for the MUNGER T ball and almost precisely of what you'd expect for the E.J. Bullock. Moreover, again, looking at as we're approaching the bridge superstructure, you can see these vents on the deck. And there's a vent fore and aft in the immediate shadow of this accommodation, the structure of the deck house. And you see that exactly on the general arrangement plans, but you do not see it on the plans for the MUNGER T ball. They're much farther aft and forward of the steel deck house. So again, we're seeing a lot of information here that supports this is the E.J. Bullock. We're seeing all these fingerprints, the DNA is coming together. All this stuff, again, all circumstantial, but it's making a very strong case that this is the E.J. Bullock, and this can't be the MUNGER T ball. So another interesting difference between the two vessels was the dimensions of the forward cargo hold. So look at the combing of this. You see on the MUNGER T ball, it had a rectangular forward cargo hold, whereas the E.J. Bullock had a 10 by 10 cargo hold entrance. So much different. So I actually swam up to the forward cargo hold, but there's a problem. There is no forward cargo hold. It is total chaos in there. And again, you can see this on the multi-beam image. That breach in the hull, you can see bent out hull plates, twisted steel from obviously some kind of damage internal. And this is consistent with the E.J. Bullock's explosion. All the records that we do have say there was an explosion in the forward cargo hold. So I'm going to pivot now from the oil wreck to the phosphate carrier. And what we see there, so again, the position, it's actually well under 2 miles of basically the box that the U-507 said it made the attack. We know she only drifted for about 15 minutes before she went under, so she's going to be very close to that location. The radio report of the Joseph M. CUDAHY puts her there. Everything lines up there. We have a wreck that is consistent. It's a tanker resting on her starboard side. What's interesting is she was struck on her starboard side. We can't see that damage because she's resting hard over, but we see an exit hole on the port side. And that's consistent with what you expect from a basic explosion tearing through the forward part of the ship as the various cargo holds erupt, as that volatile gasoline cargo just erupts in flames. We see that on other World War II casualties that carried gasoline. We see that on the City Service Empire. We saw where whole cargo holds on the attack side were collapsed and void. and hull plates ripped upward and outward on the opposite side. So again, the damage that we see on the phosphate carrier is consistent. Moreover, going in the cargo holds, there's no trace of cargo whatsoever. This is consistent with a gasoline cargo that would evaporate or burn off, or both dilute over time, much more readily than a heavier crude oil cargo that the E.J. Bullock was carrying. Again, I don't know how. Again, it's called the oil wreck. The MUNGER T Ball was not carrying oil cargo, but gasoline. So looking at the phosphate carrier, we have damage consistent with the attack. We have the location consistent with the attack. Everything lines up, the physical evidence as well. So now I mentioned that forward cargo hatch dimensions. Looking here, you see my dive partner on this dive, Jimmy Godomsky, actually going into that forward cargo hatch, and it looks rectangular. It's obviously rectangular, not 10 by 10. So again, consistent with the MUNGER T Ball. Historical record, dimensions, the cargo, what you see on the wreck itself, everything is consistent with the MUNGER T Ball. So in summary, there's absolutely no way the oil wreck is the MUNGER T Ball. And everything we see on the wreck, looking at the historical record, looking at everything at our disposal, screams the oil wreck is the E.J. Bullock. Will archaeologists and will NOAA, will the U.S. Coast Guard set the record straight? I don't know. Hopefully we get some attention on this. Hopefully reevaluate this and re-examine it, test my theory, and come to some conclusion. Because right now, I mean, you basically are saying, the Battle of Gettysburg happened in California. I mean, it's preposterous. History matters, facts matter. If you're going to memorialize the sacrifice of our merchant mariners, at least get the wreck right. Get the location right. I mean, because that just, having a memorial service and putting a plaque on the wrong wreck, that's just sad. And it's unfortunate, and hopefully we can remedy this in the near future. So I hope the information presented in this video helps support the conclusion that the oil wreck is most likely the wreck of the tanker E.J. Bullock, lost in October 1938, and not of the World War II casualty MUNGER T Ball, which most likely, most definitely rests at the site of a wreck known as the Phosphate carrier, well to the north of this site. Again, in basically more in alignment with the historical record on what we see at the wreck site itself. Now, you probably thought that I've forgotten my third wreck that I alluded to at the beginning of this video. Again, I'm trying to accomplish my own hat trick. Tried to set that out by identifying the oil wreck as the E.J. Bullock and the phosphate carrier as the MUNGER T Ball. So what is that third wreck? Well, so earlier I mentioned another character in this cast of misidentifications and entangled tankers, and that's the patrol yacht USS Coral. She was the patrol vessel dispatched by the U.S. Navy that intercepted the burning hulk of the Joseph M. CUDAHY after 2 days, and she was ordered to scuttle it as a hazard to navigation. After World War II, it seems the USS Coral was discarded by the U.S. Navy and used as a target vessel off the Marquesas, along with numerous other vessels. We do have a wreck that fits the dimensions of the USS Coral. It's in extremely shallow water here. It's a fun little site that is, again, off the beaten path. That's the third of the 3 ships in my hat trick. So hopefully this video has laid out the case for the oil wreck being the E.J. Bullock and the phosphate carrier being the MUNGER T Ball. If you like this video, I'd like to get your feedback. Send it below in the comments. And please like and share. Share with your friends on social media, because I'm sure there's quite a few people that are unaware about this battle in the Gulf of Mexico in World War II, the very first battle. So if you can share this bit of forgotten history with your friends, it'd be greatly appreciated. And hopefully one day we can set the record straight and basically identify all 3 of the victims of this first battle of the Gulf of Mexico. Well, thanks for watching. Take care.